The internet wants you to believe Diana discovered the Queen Mother was a shape-shifting reptilian. Alien overlords wearing human skin. The kind of thing that gets 2 million views on TikTok before someone remembers to fact-check it. But here's what actually happened. Diana lived at Clarence's house in early 1981 during her engagement to Charles. Weeks, under the same roof as the Queen Mother. And what she witnessed there wasn't supernatural. It was worse. Because you can't fight a lizard person. They don't exist, but you can't fight institutional cruelty either, not when it wears a grandmother's smile and has 40 years of practice hiding its teeth. The Queen Mother wasn't a monster because she was inhuman. She was a monster because she was deeply, recognizably human. Vindictive, patient, capable of nursing a grudge across 4 decades while the whole world thought she was a saint. And Diana saw it, all of it. To understand what Diana witnessed, you have to go back to December 11th, 1936, the night everything changed. Edward VIII's voice crackled through wireless sets across the British Empire that evening. I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love. 11 months. That's all his reign lasted. Less than a year on the throne and then gone. All for an American divorcée named Wallis Simpson. Millions listened in stunned silence, but one woman, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, the Duchess of York, heard those words and understood something the public didn't grasp. Her life had just been destroyed. Not literally. She wouldn't starve. She'd still have servants and jewels and palaces. But the quiet, comfortable existence she'd built, that was over. Because her husband, the shy, stammering Prince Albert, would now become King George VI. And Albert had never wanted the crown. Never been groomed for it. Never been psychologically equipped to handle it. Elizabeth had married Albert on April 26, 1923, at Westminster Abbey. The match was celebrated precisely because it seemed to free her from crushing royal expectations. Albert was the spare. Edward was the heir. Elizabeth could enjoy the relatively peaceful life of a secondary royal, raise her 2 daughters at their home at 145 Piccadilly, and never face the relentless scrutiny of the throne. She'd accepted him after he proposed twice, maybe 3 times. Accounts vary. What doesn't vary is that she knew exactly what she was getting. A quiet life out of the spotlight, married to a man who adored her but would never rule anything. The abdication shattered that assumption, completely. And she knew in her bones, that Albert wasn't built for this. His stammer wasn't mere nervousness. It was a deep-seated speech impediment that had tormented him since childhood, rooted in the exacting discipline of his father, George V, and years of feeling inferior to his golden older brother. Albert would freeze mid-sentence, jaw working silently, while courtiers and audiences waited in excruciating discomfort. The thought of addressing Parliament, of delivering Christmas broadcasts to the Empire, filled him with genuine terror. Edward had been groomed for kingship from birth. Albert had been trained for nothing of the sort. According to royal biographer Sarah Bradford's 1989 biography, King George VI, Elizabeth's reaction to the abdication was cold fury beneath a composed exterior. She channeled that fury into implacable hostility toward 2 people, Edward and Wallis Simpson. Biographers including Hugo Vickers and William Shawcross have documented that Elizabeth never forgave Edward for what she perceived as a catastrophic betrayal. A betrayal that would ultimately cost her husband his health, his happiness, and years of his life. She was right about the cost, wrong about who would pay it, and wrong about who was really to blame. The mask slipped. Not often. The Queen Mother was too skilled for that. But palace insiders documented the moments when her real feelings emerged, flashes of something cold beneath all that warmth. The most revealing came during the war years. Edward and Wallis, now the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, had settled into exile in France. Freed from royal obligations, Edward looked remarkably well, relaxed, tanned, unburdened by anything more pressing than which cocktail party to attend. George VI, by contrast, appeared increasingly haggard. The stress of wartime leadership etched deep lines into his features, premature aging visible to anyone who looked closely. Here was Edward, the man who'd abandoned his duty, looking refreshed and carefree. And here was Albert, the man who'd had duty thrust upon him, visibly deteriorating under its weight. It was in this context that Elizabeth made a remark that biographer Hugo Vickers recorded in his chronicle of the era. Upon hearing that Edward appeared relaxed while her own husband bore visible marks of exhaustion, she reportedly said to a courtier, "Who has the lines under his eyes now?" 8 words, that's all, but they reveal everything. Not grief, not concern for her husband, bitter comparison, scorecard tallying. The sentiment was consistent across multiple biographical sources. Elizabeth interpreted every sign of George VI's physical deterioration as an indictment of Edward's selfishness. She nursed this grievance with focused intensity for 40 years. Every gray hair on Albert's head was Edward's fault. Every sleepless night, every anxiety attack, every cigarette smoked to calm his nerves, all laid at the feet of the brother who'd walked away. What makes the remark significant isn't just what it reveals about her private feelings. It's what it demonstrates about her capacity for maintaining 2 entirely separate personas. In public, warmth, graciousness, effortless charm, the beloved queen consort. In private, bitter commentary about her brother-in-law's unlined face, while her husband aged before her eyes. The sweetness was real in its effects, but selective in its deployment, reserved for cameras and crowds and people who mattered, withheld from those who'd wronged her or those too insignificant to bother with. And here's where it gets complicated, because the Queen Mother wasn't playing a character during the war. She actually was brave. She actually did comfort people. The public image wasn't entirely fake. It just wasn't complete. September 13th, 1940. Buckingham Palace took a direct hit from German bombs. The chapel was destroyed. Elizabeth and George VI narrowly escaped injury, the explosion occurring while they were in the building. Her response became the most quoted remark of her life. "I'm glad we've been bombed. It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face." Whether calculated or spontaneous, the statement perfectly captured the spirit of shared sacrifice that British people craved during the Blitz. It said, "We're not hiding in Scotland while you suffer. We're here. We're bleeding too." She visited bombed-out neighborhoods throughout the Blitz, walking through rubble in her signature pastel outfits and pearls. An odd choice, the pastels, but deliberate. She wanted people to see her from a distance, wanted to be unmistakable amid the gray destruction. She refused to evacuate her daughters to Canada, like other aristocratic families had done with their children. "The princesses will not leave without me," she declared. "I will not leave without the king, and the king will never leave." The attribution to Hitler, calling her the most dangerous woman in Europe, has become legendary. Historians debate whether he actually said it. Doesn't matter. The quote captured something true about her symbolic power. She understood morale, understood that visibility mattered, that showing up mattered. But here's what the wartime mythology obscured. The woman who radiated sympathy to bomb victims could be cutting and dismissive to servants who failed her exacting standards. The duality existed not because she was fake, but because she divided the world into categories. The public deserved her best self, Staff existed in a different category entirely. Royal correspondent Ryan Hoey documented this in his 1995 book, At Home with the Queen, based on interviews with current and former palace employees. The book painted a picture of royal households where hierarchies were absolute and expectations ruthless. One former footman from Clarence House in the 1970s reportedly described the Queen Mother as a nasty piece of work. Not to the public, never to the public, only to those who existed to serve, those who weren't really people in the full sense, not to her. The disparity wasn't simple hypocrisy. She did care about the British people, in the abstract. She could weep genuine tears for families who'd lost everything to German bombs. She could also reduce a servant to tears for bringing tea at the wrong temperature. Both were true. Both existed in the same woman. She compartmentalized, maintained her public performance while treating those beneath her station with casual disregard. And she sustained both modes simultaneously for decades. Half a century of sweetness for the cameras, coldness for the help. George VI's health collapsed as the 1940s gave way to the 1950s. The strain of wartime leadership, combined with hereditary anxiety and a devastating smoking habit, had ravaged him in ways that courtiers worked desperately to hide from public view. George VI was a chain smoker of extraordinary commitment. By credible accounts, he consumed between 40 and 60 cigarettes daily throughout his adult life. Not recreational, compulsive, a means of managing near-constant anxiety that no amount of therapy or support seemed to touch. 40 to 60 cigarettes every single day. Think about what that does to a body over 20 years, 30 years. In September 1951, surgeons removed his entire left lung in a pneumonectomy procedure that the palace described vaguely as treatment for structural abnormalities. The truth, withheld from the public and perhaps partially from the king himself, lung cancer, almost certainly caused by decades of heavy tobacco use. The surgery bought a few months, but could not halt the underlying disease. Those who saw the king in his final months described a gaunt, gray figure whose complexion required brown-tinted makeup to appear anything approaching healthy in photographs. He made public appearances when absolutely necessary, but the vital, if anxious man of a decade earlier had been replaced by someone visibly dying. Everyone could see it. No one could say it. George VI died in his sleep at Sandringham on February 6, 1952, age 56. His daughter Elizabeth, then 25 and on a royal tour of Kenya, received the news that made her queen and flew home to begin a reign that would last 70 years. The Queen Mother's grief was genuine, profound, prolonged. She retreated from public life, purchased the remote Scottish castle of May in August 1952, and for a time seemed uncertain whether she would ever resume her public role. The man she loved was gone, and she blamed everyone but the tobacco companies. But here's where the story curdles. According to William Shawcross, who had unprecedented access to royal archives for his 2009 authorized biography, the Queen Mother blamed Edward's abdication for placing an unbearable burden on her husband that shortened his life. She stated that she could never forgive Edward for what he had done to her husband. Never forgive. Not struggled to forgive. Not eventually came to terms with. Never. The medical record tells a different story. George VI's lung cancer developed in a man who had smoked 40 to 60 cigarettes daily for decades, a habit he maintained throughout his adult life, including during his years as Duke of York, before any question of kingship arose. The anxiety that drove this habit predated the abdication. It was rooted in childhood trauma, in the exacting discipline of his father George V, in the humiliation of his stammer that had tormented him since boyhood. Albert was anxious long before Edward fell in love with Wallis Simpson. He was smoking heavily long before December 1936. The abdication intensified George VI anxiety, likely increased his smoking. But the medical cause of death was the cancer that developed in his lung tissue. Lung cancer caused by tobacco, not lung cancer caused by having a selfish brother. The Queen Mother blamed Edward for killing her husband through stress. George VI smoked 40 to 60 cigarettes daily. His left lung was removed due to cancer. He died at 56. The Duke of Windsor lived until May 28, 1972, dying at 77. Edward, the villain of Elizabeth's narrative, outlived his brother by 20 years. 20 years of comfortable exile while Elizabeth polished her husband's memory into sainthood and sharpened her hatred into something she could maintain indefinitely. Make of that what you will. While Edward bore the Queen Mother's anger for the abdication, Wallis Simpson became the focus of something more visceral, a contempt maintained with remarkable consistency for over 4 decades. Edward was weak, in Elizabeth's view. He'd abandoned duty for love, but Wallis was predatory. She'd lured him, trapped him, destroyed the monarchy's stability for her own ambition. According to Hugo Vickers' biography, Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, Elizabeth referred to Wallis as the lowest of the low. In more guarded moments, simply, that woman, a designation requiring no further explanation in royal circles. Everyone knew who that woman was. The phrase dripped with contempt so practiced, it had become reflexive. The most concrete manifestation of this hostility? The systematic denial of the title Her Royal Highness to the Duchess of Windsor. When Edward abdicated, he was granted the title Duke of Windsor, and his HRH continued. He remained a Royal Highness even in exile. But the letters patent issued by George VI on May 27, 1937, explicitly excluded any future wife from sharing this dignity. Wallis could be called the Duchess of Windsor, but not Her Royal Highness the Duchess of Windsor. This might seem like a minor distinction, a technicality, protocol nonsense that only matters to people who care about such things. It wasn't. In the hierarchy-obsessed world of royalty, it was a deliberate and devastating snub. It meant Wallis was required to curtsy to every other female member of the royal family, including women who had married into the family far more recently than she had, women younger than her, women who'd contributed nothing to the institution except marrying the right person. All of them ranked above the woman who'd given up everything to marry the King of England. It placed her, in the arcane hierarchy of royal precedence, below virtually everyone. A permanent reminder that she didn't belong, would never belong, could never be fully accepted no matter how many decades passed. Biographer Michael Thornton indicated that the Queen Mother was the denial's most passionate advocate. She lobbied consistently against any rehabilitation of the Windsor's status, opposed any suggestion that Wallis be granted the dignity of true family membership, ensured the exclusion remained in place throughout her lifetime. When Edward and Wallis visited Britain, rarely, reluctantly, they weren't invited to family gatherings at Balmoral or Sandringham. Royal weddings and funerals either excluded them entirely or relegated them to positions emphasizing their outsider status. They were family, but not family. Windsors who weren't really Windsors. 40 years. That's how long the Queen Mother sustained this campaign. 4 decades of ensuring a woman knew she would never truly belong. 4 decades of social exclusion enforced with impeccable courtesy. The knife always wrapped in velvet. And then Edward died. May 28, 1972, Paris. 77 years old. And something strange happened. Royal biographer Ingrid Seward documented a remarkable detail in her biography, examining the Queen Mother's relationships. After decades of public hostility and documented contempt, The Queen Mother began sending Christmas cards to the widowed Wallis Simpson, annual correspondence, year after year, to a woman she had spent 36 years treating as a pariah. Wallis lived on in declining health at her home on the Bois de Boulogne in Paris. Her mind deteriorated, likely dementia. She became increasingly isolated, increasingly confused. The glamorous woman who'd captivated a king reduced to a frail figure, cared for by nurses who didn't know her history. And every Christmas, a card arrived from the woman who had lobbied to deny her even the basic dignity of an HRH title. Seward's account doesn't specify what the cards said, whether they were signed formally as Elizabeth R. or with something more personal, whether they contained actual warmth or merely observed the rituals of correspondence. What Seward documented was the fact of their existence, annual greetings from the architect of Wallis's exclusion to the widow now living in isolation. Think about what this means. Here was a woman who had maintained implacable hostility toward Wallis for over 3 decades, blamed her for seducing Edward, blamed her for the abdication, blamed her for George VI's death, lobbied against any gesture of acceptance, ensured she could never use the title that would have made her a true member of the family. And then, Christmas cards. The cards reveal that the Queen Mother's public vendetta coexisted with private gestures contradicting the sustained hostility she displayed to the world. Whether they represented genuine sympathy for a fellow widow, conscience-clearing gestures, social obligation, or something else entirely remains unknown. Maybe she felt something soften when Edward died. Maybe she realized the woman she'd hated for 4 decades was now alone and declining, and no longer a threat to anyone. But they demonstrate something crucial, a capacity for maintaining contradictory public and private positions over extended periods. The public face of implacable hostility, the private reality of annual Christmas greetings, both true simultaneously. 2 faces, one for the cameras, one for when she thought no one was watching. And sometimes, apparently, neither matched what she actually did. Diana Spencer arrived at Clarence's house in early 1981, 19 years old, engaged to the Prince of Wales, about to undergo the transformation from aristocratic nursery school teacher to most photographed woman on Earth. The arrangement was intended to protect her from media scrutiny during the engagement period. Photographers camped outside her flat. Reporters followed her everywhere. Clarence's house offered sanctuary, the Queen Mother's official London residence, protected by palace security and royal protocol. It also gave Diana extended opportunity to observe the Queen Mother at close range, not at formal occasions, where everyone performed their assigned roles, in her domestic environment, day after day, week after week, behind the scenes where the performance relaxed. Andrew Morton's 1992 book, Diana, Her True Story, based on secret tape recordings Diana made in collaboration with the author, provides the most direct access to her views of the institution she'd joined. Diana described the royal family as the firm, not affectionately. The term emphasized its corporate, unfeeling nature. A business enterprise masquerading as a family. She spoke of feeling isolated, unsupported during her struggles with bulimia, bewildered by a family that viewed emotional vulnerability as weakness, requiring correction rather than compassion. She expected a family and got an institution, expected warmth and got protocol. In her 1995 Panorama interview with Martin Bashir, Diana described the royal establishment as something that had to be understood to be believed, a culture alien to outsiders. 20 million people watched her that night. 20 million people heard her describe a world where image trumped everything, where asking for help was seen as failing, where the institution mattered more than the individuals trapped inside it. What Diana witnessed at Clarence House in 1981 fitted a pattern that palace staff had documented for decades. The warmth reserved for social equals and public occasions. The different treatment for those who existed primarily to serve. The capacity for sustained coldness beneath the grandmotherly exterior that the British public adored. William Tallon, who served as the Queen Mother's page for over 50 years and was known within the household as Backstairs Billy, provided accounts after her death revealing the complexity of working for her. He spoke of her demanding nature, her expectation of absolute discretion. Anything that happened within Clarence House stayed within Clarence House. Her capacity to freeze out those who displeased her while showering favorites with affection. Tallon himself was a favorite. He survived 50 years. Others weren't so fortunate. The household had a clear hierarchy of those who'd earned approval and those who hadn't, and moving between categories was rare. Paul Burrell, who served as a footman at Buckingham Palace before becoming Princess Diana's butler, described in his 2003 memoir, A Royal Duty, the hierarchical culture of royal households. Burrell's account, while focused primarily on Diana, included observations about the broader household culture that the Queen Mother had helped shape over decades. This was how royals treated staff. This was normal. This was expected. Diana wasn't paranoid. She wasn't mentally unstable, whatever the palace briefings implied during and after her divorce. She was a witness, one of many, to behavior that insiders had observed for generations. The difference? Diana talked, publicly, to Morton, to Bashir, to anyone who would listen once she realized the institution would never protect her the way she'd assumed it would. So what do we actually know? We know Elizabeth Bowes Lyon never wanted to be queen, that the abdication of December 11, 1936, forced her reluctant husband onto a throne that would slowly destroy him, or that she believed destroyed him. We know she blamed Edward and Wallis for that destruction, blamed them completely, blamed them forever. Even as George VI smoked himself to death with 40 to 60 cigarettes daily, even as his own anxiety predated any question of kingship by decades. The narrative of Edward's betrayal was cleaner than the reality of her husband's self-destruction. We know she maintained a 40-year vendetta against Wallis Simpson, called her the lowest of the low, lobbied to deny her the HRH title on May 27, 1937, and for every year afterward. Ensured she remained an outsider at every royal gathering for decades. We know that after all that, she sent Christmas cards to the widow. We know staff described her as a nasty piece of work. We know the warmth she showed the public was selective, withheld from those she considered beneath her. We know Diana lived under her roof at Clarence House in 1981 and witnessed this culture firsthand. We know Diana later described the royal family as the firm and spoke of its coldness and insularity. The conspiracy theorists want you to believe Diana discovered something supernatural, shapeshifters, alien bloodlines, reptilian overlords pretending to be human. The kind of nonsense that sounds exciting, but means nothing because it points at nothing real. Nothing you could ever prove or disprove. The truth is worse, because the truth is ordinary. Human vindictiveness, institutional cruelty with a smiling face. A woman who could comfort bomb victims and freeze out her sister-in-law with equal conviction. Both real, both her. The Queen Mother lived until March 30th, 2002, dying at 101 years old, beloved by the British public to the end. Her funeral drew hundreds of thousands of mourners. The mythology she'd spent 8 decades building remained intact, but she shaped something more lasting than her own reputation. She shaped royal attitudes toward divorce, toward outsiders, toward anyone who threatened the carefully maintained image. She taught the institution that mythology must be protected at all costs, that appearances matter more than truth, that you can be vicious in private as long as you're charming in public. Diana threatened that mythology, and the institution that the Queen Mother had helped shape, cold, image-obsessed, skilled at maintaining two faces, closed ranks against her. It knew how to handle outsiders who didn't fit. It had been practicing for 40 years. The monster was never supernatural. It was institutional vindictiveness wearing a grandmother's smile, a grudge maintained across 4 decades, a capacity to be one thing in public and another in private, a system that valued appearance over substance, mythology over truth, silence over honesty. And it's still there, still shaping how the monarchy treats those who don't fit the image, still punishing outsiders who dare to speak openly about what they've witnessed. Ask Meghan Markle. Ask anyone who's tried to tell the truth about what happens behind palace walls. Diana knew. Not because she uncovered reptilian overlords, because she paid attention. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in the world is just someone watching carefully and remembering, and eventually deciding to talk. Subscribe for more stories like this.